been quite some time since I've explored the Switch library with the latest version of the Sudachi emulator on Android. Now I thought it'd be interesting to see what's possible with one of Retroid's latest devices, the Retroid Pocket Classic, which at first glance seems like the most unlikely place to play some Switch games. But, as it always does, curiosity got the best of me, and in particular, I wanted to see what the Snapdragon G1 Gen 2 was capable of, which is a new chipset never before seen until the Classic, and so it's the first time that it makes an appearance here on the channel. Besides that, I also wanted to showcase games that work without the need for any analog sticks, since if you've noticed, the Classic has exactly 0 of them. So please join me, Rob the Retro Tech Dad, as we explore the possibilities of Switch emulation on the Retroid Pocket Classic. As always, let's go through the setup and install process for the latest version of the Sudachi emulator, which is currently version 1.0.15 and can be downloaded straight from the Sudachi website or from its GitHub page, which I will have linked down in the description. You can do all of this right on your Classic device using a browser like Chrome, which is included with it. On the Sudachi website, click on the latest build dropdown and then click on the Android button to download the version for Android. And you might get a prompt to allow it to download files from here, and after it's done downloading, you may need to allow Chrome to install apps from unknown sources, which you can toggle on. After that, you should be able to install Sudachi, and once done, click on open and we can quickly go through the setup process. You should get the welcome and get started screen, and then you will be prompted by Sudachi to provide both the prod keys and title keys for Switch, which I cannot share here but can be obtained from your own Switch, which is a pretty easy search. After loading up your prod and title keys, you can then point Sudachi to your games folder, and I usually just create a folder called Switch either on the internal or external storage, and then place my games there. And with that, we are now on the main screen of Sudachi. Now if you have games loaded, just give it a moment to display the game icons, depending on how many you have in your folder. So let's now focus in on the gear icon on the top left, and just go over our default settings for this video. There are a few important things that can be done here, and since we have a Snapdragon chipset, we can in theory use custom drivers like the turnip drivers, but as of right now, we don't really have anything that supports this new chipset from Qualcomm, and this is the first device that actually uses the G1 Gen 2 and the Adreno A15, so don't expect anything just yet for this. Now all of my testing was done with the default system driver, which is currently version 615.86, and as such, we will leave this section alone. Let's go back one step, and there's another very important thing that I highly recommend doing before trying out any games, and specifically the games I showcase here, which is to load the Switch firmware. You can do this by going into the Manage Sudachi Data section, and then from here you can load in your firmware file, which can be left in the zip format. I can't share the Switch firmware files here, but it is an easy Google search, and you should be able to find what you're looking for. It's important to match your firmware file to the version that your prod and title keys are using. Now there are some other things that can be adjusted here, including your controls, but Sudachi does detect the inputs automatically, so we don't actually have to configure anything here. Let's now head into the advanced settings and just quickly go over the default settings for this video. I will let you know throughout the video if anything deviates from these default settings, but for the most part, things are relatively simple here. In the system section, make sure to toggle off the dock mode, as every game in this showcase will be using the handheld mode option, and everything else can be left at default. In the graphics section, we will only be making one change here from the default Sudachi settings, which is to force the 4:3 aspect ratio so that we can utilize more of the screen here on the Retroid Pocket Classic. If you don't mind stretching, you can definitely go with the stretch to fill option. And if you really don't want to do any of that, just leave it at the default 16:9. Everything else will remain the same, which means we will keep it at the 1x native resolution, and all the toggles down below will remain at default, with just the disk shader cache option left on by default. I have found that for the games in this showcase, we really won't need to deviate from that, but again, I will let you know throughout the video if there are any changes. And if we go back, everything else remains at default, including the audio and then the debug sections. To make a per game change to the settings, it's quite simple. All you have to do is hold down on the game icon that you want to modify the settings for, and then you will be taken to a separate screen, and from here you can modify the settings as needed, and then when you make the change, just back out and it will automatically be saved. And of course, as I always do for these types of videos, especially when it comes to Switch emulation, I like to keep expectations in check, since Switch emulation, especially on Android, is very fragmented and has seen many roadblocks in the past year. As such, development is kind of stagnant for Switch emulation on Android, and what's here is very much incomplete. Which means that things like games crashing, locking up, refusing to load, poor performance, and other glitches, issues, and whatnot should be expected with Switch emulation on Android. There will be times that a game that worked before will refuse to load, and I've had to actually close out Sudachi a couple times in order for it to launch again properly, so expect that things like that can happen here as well. I've also experienced sound issues with games that shouldn't have any, and if this does happen to you, again, it's just best to fully close out Sudachi and then launch the game again, and the issues should be resolved. The reality is that Switch emulation is nowhere near perfect, but personally, I think part of the fun is exploring what can be done, and as I always do, I like to show off games that seem to work quite well here with the Retroid Pocket Classic specifically. And after testing a huge amount of games, not just for compatibility and performance, but also for the control schemes as well. And I ended up with a surprisingly larger than expected list of games. The Retroid Pocket Classic is a $130 device, and so keep your expectations in check in terms of running games like Breath of the Wild on here, not just because of the controller limitations, but simply because the performance isn't there for this device. But surprisingly, a lot of Switch games run well, but regardless, this is still very much a bonus platform here, and it really is just fun to see what we can get away with. So enough of all that, it's time for our games showcase, which features 30 games, and I will detail the settings used and any changes needed throughout the video. So let's kick things off with Bastion, which was the first game ever from Supergiant Games, the same studio responsible for the amazing Hades, and certainly no stranger to the channel. Bastion is an action RPG known for its beautiful art style, really interesting dynamic narration that responds to in-game events, and of course great combat. I was pretty excited to see that this one not only works very well at native resolution, but it actually works well on the Classic and doesn't need any analog stick controls, so it's smooth sailing for the device with absolutely no changes needed to the default settings, and honestly I think we're off to a great start. Now I did test Transistor and it does work well, but I personally found Bastion to work better with just the D-pad only controls on the Classic. Next up we have a lesser known game from Nintendo's eShop library, Box Boy and Box Girl, which was developed by the folks responsible for Kirby, HAL Laboratory, and this is just a fun puzzle platformer that really lends itself well to handheld devices like the Classic. Now despite the fairly simple looking graphics, I did need to drop this one down to 0.75x resolution for smoother performance on the Classic, but even at the lower scale the visuals look sharp due to the clean lines and simplistic style, which actually makes it a great fit here, and I will warn you in advance, since it is quite addictive, that you might actually have a difficult time putting this one down. If you've never played Cat Quest 2, you are definitely in for a treat. Developed by the Gentle Bros, this is another action RPG making a list that lets you switch between a sword-swinging cat and a spell-casting dog as you explore a world full of loot, quests, and of course, feline humor. Naturally, this is the sequel to the original Cat Quest, which did receive a port to the Google Play Store, but unfortunately this sequel will most likely never make its way over to Android, since it is an Apple Arcade exclusive in the mobile space, and so this Switch port is the best we're going to get. I was pleasantly surprised to see this one running decently at native resolution with the default settings. Now at this resolution, the overworld is not at full speed, but definitely not much of an issue, and the dungeons are running at full speed, so you can always drop the resolution scaling down if it is an issue. The controls work pretty well here despite the lack of any analog stick inputs. I don't think it's too much of a surprise that Celeste makes the list here, which is just an amazing indie game that deserves a playthrough on really any platform. Celeste has always been a very stable and consistent performer when it comes to Switch emulation, so the results here aren't too surprising. Celeste performs very well in native resolution on the Retroid Pocket Classic, and the pixel art looks razor sharp, and personally I always love launching this game so I can hear the wonderful soundtrack, which is always a joy to listen to again. I also really love the Retroid D-pad, and so it's always a treat to play Celeste with a Retroid device, and again I think it's a good fit for the Classic, and obviously doesn't require any analog stick controls, and really the D-pad is the proper way to play this one. I don't think it's much of a surprise for my regular viewers that some type of shmup makes the list here, and this will actually be one of a few shmups since naturally I think a lot of these games will work quite well without the need for analog sticks. Cotton Reboot, which is known as a Q-em-up, is a pretty cool entry and serves as a revival of the classic Cotton series. I think this is an awesome reboot with a new arrange mode that features redesigned graphics and characters, but very much stays true to the gameplay that the series is known for, and does a great job modernizing the franchise and making it accessible to newcomers to the series. On the Retroid Pocket Classic, I have the game running at native resolution, and I think due to the game's vibrant art style, it works quite well on the Classic's display, and given that performance is solid as well as controls that match up well, this one is a great fit for a device like the Classic. Now this one is kind of an interesting and fun game with Retroid Castle from Hipster Whale, which is a vertical platforming spin-off of the original mobile hit Retroid. It turns the endless Frogger formula into a climbing challenge through procedurally generated towers. Surprisingly, I did need to turn the resolution down to 0.75x in order to get it to run as you see here, but with that change it does run pretty well. I was slightly concerned that the visual style would get lost on the screen, especially since we're doing some stretching, but I think it does hold up quite well on the Classic. This one is designed specifically for short bursts, which definitely makes it a good fit for handheld devices. And Retroid Castle is yet another Apple Arcade mobile exclusive, and so you can forget about a version on the Google Play Store. Now it's been a while since I've featured Cruisin' and Blast in a Switch-focused showcase, which is a Switch exclusive and originally began life as an arcade game, but since Nintendo now owns the rights to the Cruisin' series, it makes sense that the Switch receive this port. I absolutely love this game, which has become a fairly stable and solid performer for Switch emulation across a multitude of devices. This one is definitely a selfish inclusion because it's one of the few I'm featuring here that requires the drop to 0.5x native resolution to get the performance you're seeing on screen, and while not quite 60 frames per second all the time, it really doesn't seem to impact this game too much, and the result is something that's always fast and over the top, which is what I love most about this game. The graphics surprisingly hold up well at this resolution and look vibrant and gorgeous on the Classic display, and best of all, we don't need no stinking analog sticks for this one. Cuphead is another gem of a game that makes the list, and is a run-and-gun style game developed by Studio MDHR, and probably best known for its awesome 1930s cartoon animation style and punishing difficulty. There is a homebrew port of this game available for Android, but I figured it'd be worth testing and including the Switch version here. And for the Retroid Pocket Classic, I do recommend dialing back the resolution and setting it to 0.75x, which will help Cuphead run a lot smoother, and that's definitely something you want for this game given the precision needed to overcome many of its challenges. The visuals look absolutely phenomenal on the Classic's OLED screen, and I think it's another good fit for the device with gameplay that lends itself well to the limited controls. Disney Illusion Island was very much a pleasant surprise for me, and in many ways feels like a modern take on the classic Mickey games from the past like Castle of Illusion, but with an awesome, whimsical, and modern cartoon style. This was developed by Delilah Studios, who worked on the Battletoads revival over on Xbox. Disney Illusion Island feels like a cartoon that has come to life with its gorgeous animation. This is another game that benefits from the 0.75x resolution, which definitely helps smooth out the performance in-game, and thankfully doesn't take away from the great visual style, and it still holds up on the Classic screen, especially thanks to the vivid OLED display. Again, I think this is another great fit for the Classic that kind of channels the whole retro vibes that the device gives off. And it's almost impossible to not mention Fez, which at this point is one of the most well-known indie games out there and quite influential in terms of indie game design. Fez is quite the unique game and is a puzzle platformer that plays with perspective, letting you rotate the world to reveal new paths and secrets. Fez started out as an Xbox exclusive, but nowadays can be played on tons of platforms, and thanks to the Switch version, it can be played on Android devices. Now this one really surprised me with its performance, since we can actually get away with running Fez at native resolution on the Classic with just some minor dips here and there depending on some scenes, but for the most part this one is quite solid. You can always drop the resolution as needed since we are at native here in this footage. I will say that this is a game that I experienced a crash in, so just be mindful, but in the past I've had pretty good success with Fez. I've got a pretty cool one up next, and for fans of old school beat 'em ups like Streets of Rage or Final Fight, then Final Vendetta from Bitmap Bureau should definitely be on your radar. This is a beat 'em up with awesome chunky sprites, slick animations, and a killer techno soundtrack that really does capture the essence of the games that inspired it. And this is another game that runs incredibly well at native resolution, and thanks to the large character sprites makes it one of the better games to visually enjoy on the Classic's smaller screen. And since this is a 2D style beat 'em up, the controls on the Classic are an absolute perfect fit for this game, and another one that is well worth trying out on the device. Freedom Planet 2 makes a return to the channel, which at first glance looks like something that belongs on a Sega console, or at least was developed by Sonic Team, but in fact it's neither of those things. Freedom Planet 2 comes to us from Galaxy Trail, released just back in 2022, and the sequel very much improves on the original in almost every way, which both takes from the fast-paced Sonic-inspired gameplay, but very much adds its own distinct flair. I don't think it's too surprising, but the game does run at native resolution on the Classic, and I didn't run into any stutter or glitches during gameplay. It's also a visual delight with tons of action happening on screen, lots of color and detailed backgrounds, and definitely stands out here. Again, much like the other games on this list so far, Freedom Planet 2 is a solid fit for the classic and not impeded at all by the lack of analog sticks. Guacamelee makes a return to the channel, and if you haven't heard of this game before, it's an awesome Metroidvania style game that is inspired by traditional Mexican culture and folklore with an awesome lucha libre aesthetic. At this point, I'd say it's another classic which mixes solid platforming, combat, and puzzle solving with humor and gorgeous 2D visuals. On the Pocket Classic, Guacamelee benefits from being scaled down slightly to 0.75x native resolution, which hits the sweet spot in terms of maintaining stable performance while still looking great. The animation style lends itself well to downscaling and holds up at this resolution on the smaller classic screen. We finally made it to our next shmup on the list, and I believe this is another one I actually may have never featured before on the channel, but man, it is such a cool game and so unlike many other shoot-'em-ups out there. Jamestown Plus is a game that takes place on Mars, and okay, maybe not the wildest storyline, except that it takes place in an alternate history during the 17th century, with Mars being an English colony that is contested by the Spanish and the indigenous Martians. The shmup mechanics are great, and the developers of the game, Final Form Games, used cave shooters like Pro Gear as an inspiration for the gameplay and the art style, which is influenced by Miyazaki films like Castle in the Sky. This is definitely well worth checking out just for the simple fact that it's so very different from many of the shmups on the market, and best of all, it runs great here on the Retroid Pocket Classic at native resolution, and of course this shmup works great with just the D-pad. I guess we can't talk about Switch without mentioning something related to Mario, and I definitely was determined to get something Mario related working on the Classic using Switch emulation. Now, similar to Cruisin' and Blast, this one is a selfish inclusion since I really enjoyed Mario vs. Donkey Kong and I couldn't resist including it here. This is a puzzle platformer which has been reimagined for the Switch with updated graphics and mechanics. Honestly, I'm shocked to get it running at all on the Classic, and this will be the only other game that does require the drop to 0.5x resolution to get the stable performance that you see here in the footage. This is another game that seemingly feels right on the Classic and looks decent stretched to the 4:3 aspect ratio that I'm using here, and given the nature of the gameplay, it makes sense on a device like the Classic with no issues using the controls. Mega Man 11 brings the Blue Bomber back in style with updated 2.5D visuals and a new double gear system that adds time slowing and power boosting mechanics. I really enjoy this entry in the Mega Man franchise, which definitely feels like a modern classic and respects the franchise while refreshing the formula. On the Pocket Classic, I'd say you're going to want to use the 0.75x resolution, which does mostly well here, but if you're really a stickler for performance, you can always go down to 0.5x, but I don't think it's needed, and it is a good balance between performance and visual fidelity. The game's graphics still hold up at the lower resolution, and again, it just feels right at home on a device like the Classic, and of course the gameplay style works very well with the awesome Retroid D-pad. If you've never played Monster Sanctuary before, this one is definitely a unique gem, and I don't believe I've ever featured it before on the channel, but to be fair, I've talked about a lot of Switch games here. Monster Sanctuary is, simply put, Pokemon meets Metroidvania. This indie gem lets you collect monsters, battle them in turn-based fights, and then use their abilities to explore a sprawling world, but in an awesome 2D side-scrolling style. The team building aspect in Monster Sanctuary is also very interesting, which only adds to the entire package, and if you're slightly intrigued by monster collecting type games, or Metroidvanias, definitely give this one a shot. Performance-wise, it's one of the smoothest titles in this whole lineup, and probably not all too surprising, but I was able to run this one in native resolution without any changes needed, and it works great with just the D-pad only controls, and is a great fit here for the Classic. I really wanted to include a Persona game here, and realistically one game came to mind as an option that could possibly work with the Classic. Persona 4 Arena Ultimax is a 2D fighting game developed by Arc System Works, the same studio responsible for games like Guilty Gear, so this team definitely knows a thing or two about this genre. Persona 4 Arena is a spin-off that combines the gorgeous visual style of the Persona universe with fast-paced 2D combat that very much channels the studio's signature style. For the most part, I'd say this one does pretty well in native resolution, but you might see some dips in performance during supers or busy moments. If you're not aiming for competitive play, and let's be honest, you're most likely not on a Retroid Pocket Classic, it's definitely playable with the visuals in particular being a highlight here on the gorgeous OLED display. Personally for me, I think it's just impressive to see it running here at all, and of course given that this is a 2D fighting game, the D-pad only controls with the Classic pose no issue for Ultimax. We've got two legendary puzzle franchises colliding in the very awesome Puyo Puyo Tetris 2, which is perfect for those that can't decide between either Puyo Puyo or Tetris, and best of all, you can play them individually or in a mode that mashes them both together. It's chaotic, brilliant, and even has a single player story mode included. The best part is that it runs really well in native resolution, and the only time I really experienced a frame rate dip was at the menu screen right before starting a match, which isn't too much of a deal breaker and well worth the trade-off to have this awesome puzzle game playable with Sudachi. And again, thanks to the art and gameplay style, I think it's another one that works really well with the classic screen. Rayman Legends makes the list, and one that certainly has been featured before, but it's hard to not include this game since thanks to the Ubi art engine, it is an absolutely gorgeous looking game with a beautiful art style, and amazingly was originally released more than 10 years ago, but regardless still holds up incredibly well with great level design. Rayman Legends has definitely been around with ports available on a bunch of consoles, and at least in terms of ways we can play it on Android, we do potentially have the Vita, Wii U, and PC versions to check out, but luckily for Switch fans, this version does work quite well with Sudachi using the native resolution that maintains pretty solid frame rate. For whatever reason, this was always a game that I needed to launch twice in order to have the game load properly, and I'm curious if others will have the same issue, but it does seem to work great on that second launch, so I'll chalk it up to one of those weird quirks, with an emulator that obviously is not going to be perfect given the current state of development on it. We've got another shmup on the list, and I'm pretty excited to feature Rolling Gunner, which is a top tier shmup that will satisfy your senses visually with tasty graphics, but the gameplay itself is super tight, and honestly an awesome shmup for those that might be a bit intimidated by the genre, with its casual mode that really ends up just being a normal mode in terms of difficulty. If you want an idea of the kind of lineage behind Rolling Gunner, the game was directed by an ex-Cave programmer, the same studio responsible for incredible shmups like Dodonpachi and Death Smiles, and so it definitely speaks highly to the game. Rolling Gunner is quite a hectic game, and as such, for this one you will probably want to drop the resolution scaling down to 0.75x, and with that the game's performance is pretty stable and runs quite well with Sudachi. Sayonara Wild Hearts is one of my personal favorites on the list, and one that I've featured repeatedly on the channel with its gorgeous visuals that is best described as a rhythm game meets visual album. The soundtrack is quite memorable and very fitting for the themes presented in the game, and the bold neon colors displayed really lend itself very well to the OLED panel, with a lot of darker scenes that look just crisp as can be here on the classics display. This is another one of those Apple Arcade exclusives for mobile, so it's great we have the Switch version that has been a very stable game with emulation across lots of devices. The game does run very well in native resolution, which is definitely responsible for that crispness on this display, and given the way the gameplay works is another solid option for the classic with its D-pad setup. And we have another consistent performer with Switch emulation, Scott Pilgrim vs. the World. The game is a 2D side-scrolling beat-em-up inspired by the graphic novels and movie of the same name that was developed by Ubisoft of all studios, and is actually a pretty old game that became delisted and then returned in 2021 with this complete edition. So now we have even more ways to enjoy this game, including of course this Switch version, which is one of the earliest games I remember testing with Switch emulation and has been an excellent performer on tons of different devices. Unsurprisingly, this game runs at native resolution without much issue, and it's another one that works well despite the lack of any analog sticks on the classic. Shovel Knight Dig is a spin-off that takes Yacht Club's beloved Pixel Knight and throws him into a roguelite platformer with a twist. Shovel Knight Dig, as its name implies, focuses on the digging aspects while looking for gold and treasure. It's got the same charm and same tight controls, but very much feels like a mashup of Shovel Knight with something like SteamWorld Dig or Spelunky because of its downward-focused adventure, with procedurally generated levels and of course the gorgeous pixel art the series is known for. This is yet another game that was released for the Apple Arcade exclusively for mobile, which means that we are again fortunate to have this Switch port that runs quite well with Sudachi. I have Shovel Knight's Dig set to use native resolution, and outside of some frame rate dips here and there, the game does mostly well. The graphics are a great fit for this display, and of course the gameplay mechanic is perfect for that pick up and go style that works well with handhelds. And of course we gotta follow up with another Shovel Knight game, and this time around we have Shovel Knight Pocket Dungeon, which yet again takes the franchise in a totally different direction. It's a blend of falling block puzzlers and roguelite dungeon crawling that works out pretty well with all of these Shovel Knight charm. There was an Android version of Pocket Dungeon available thanks to Netflix, but it actually has since been removed from Netflix and is now no longer available on mobile in any way outside of finding old files of the game or using the Switch version with Sudachi. Similar to Shovel Knight Dig, the game performs quite well in native resolution, and the pixel art looks great on the Classic's display. It's a great game for Shovel Knight fans looking to satisfy that puzzle itch. One of the earliest games to run well with Switch emulation, and kind of the go-to for testing, has always been Sonic Mania, which also happens to be an awesome game that is a celebration of classic 2D Sonic, developed by Christian Whitehead and a dream team of Sonic fans turned devs, and it definitely nails the look and feel of the Genesis era games, and honestly, better than most of the Sonic games that came before this one. On the Pocket Classic, Sonic Mania does run at native resolution, except that there is some slowdown in the bonus stages, so it's really just a matter of preference. But you can always turn down the resolution scaling, but for me personally, I found that the game runs well enough at just native resolution, and really outside of the bonus stages, the game's fast-paced action runs beautifully. The colors pop, the music sounds great, and the D-pad makes this feel like a proper retro experience. SteamWorld Dig, developed by Image and Form, is one of the best Metroidvania-style experiences out there with its mix of exploration, mining, and upgrades that really hit that dopamine loop just right. SteamWorld Dig is now part of a fairly large franchise and set of games which includes a sequel to Dig as well as other games like Heist and Build. On the Pocket Classic, the original game does perform better than its sequel, which is why it's the one I decided to feature here on the Classic. I will say that it's probably best to go with the 0.75x resolution scaling for the best performance, but the game is pretty close to running full speed at native resolution as well. It's another game that I was happy to find works well with just the D-pad. The Alto Collection makes an appearance for the first time on the channel, at least in a Switch showcase, and I know what you're thinking, why would I feature this game if it's one that's readily available on the Google Play Store? But honestly, it's a neat collection of the two Alto games, Alto's Adventure and Alto's Odyssey, that has built-in controls, which to be fair, there isn't much here, and you could in theory use the built-in gamepad mapping tool on the Classic, but hey, this version exists and it runs well, and it's a very zen-like game that I enjoy unwinding with in bed. The clean visuals look really good on the Classic display, and all in all, it's one that I don't think many even realize made its way to the Nintendo Switch. The Messenger is another awesome indie game that comes to us from Canadian developer Sabotage Studio, and published by Devolver Digital, who just seems to have a knack for publishing fantastic games. The Messenger is an action platformer and Metroidvania style game that is inspired by games like Ninja Gaiden, and one of the coolest things with the Messenger are the visuals and audio that changes from 8-bit to 16-bit styles, which represents the ninja's journey from the past to the future. The game has great pixel art style and surprisingly great dialogue filled with humor. The Messenger is a fantastic game that works very well here on the Classic, and I think it looks great with this display, and given the nature of the game, it plays very well with just the D-pad. Now let's wrap up this showcase with Windjammers 2, which is the long-awaited sequel to the Neo Geo Classic. This was developed by .emu, the same studio responsible for other sequels to old gems like Streets of Rage 4, Shredder's Revenge, and Wonder Boy. It's a fast-paced arcade sports game that feels like Pong on steroids with high-flying discs, anime-style special moves, and over-the-top action. And I have to say I am absolutely terrible at this game, and I could probably say the same for the original, despite loving both of these games since they're both fun to pick up and play. Seriously, the graphics are gorgeous, and the clean hand-drawn visuals look beautiful on the Pocket Classic's display. And best of all, performance is solid at native resolution, with no tweaks needed. And that does it for this video, and I have to say I am pretty impressed by how well some of these games performed. Especially considering we are talking about a device that costs $130, and just the fact that there are plenty of games that work great with just the D-pad on the Switch. As always, let me know in the comments what you think, and if you've had success with games that I haven't tried out yet. Until next time, as always, I am the Retro Tech Dad, and thank you so much for watching.